Welcome aboard. It's Captain G. Eggman and I are halfway through turn one, and I wanted to real quick, hopefully quickly, give you a recap on the first half of our first turn of this game. This is the first time we're playing it, and we're assuming first time many of you have seen this game as well. Each turn has a specific sequence of steps for the Japanese and the U.S. player to alternate in, similar to HBG's Operation Barbarossa game or the Axis and Allies D-Day game, if you're familiar with either one of those. The first half of the turn is really focused on the air and naval battle. Eggman had to set up his fleet in the different zones, decide what ships were in what areas to protect the transports, to protect his carrier assets. There are limits. Any zone, land or sea, can only have a maximum of 12 units, not counting air and not counting any embarked troops or equipment onto the transports. So he distributed his fleet strategically at the beginning of the game. Then ordinarily we'd roll for initiative, but turn one, the U.S. has the initiative by invading, so we skipped that step. Turn two was the kamikaze assignments. So kamikazes, the only thing Japan can do with their fighter aircraft in this game are kamikaze attacks on ships. That's it. No air-to-air, no ground support, nothing. It's only kamikaze attacks. They get 4 kamikazes every turn that they have for every airbase. And you use them, and then the next turn you have 4 more kamikazes in those air bases. So Japan starts with 8 air bases. That's 32 kamikaze attacks. What I did was I put 5 attacks in each of these 4 zones for Task Force 51, where his landing force was coming in. And then I put the remaining 12 into one zone to try to maximize the chances of doing damage to his carrier fleet. I did hit 2 fleet carrier ships and completely sunk with 2 hits this escort carrier. So that was pretty good. And then in these zones, I had 2 hits on a battleship. I hit in this zone 1 landing craft, which cost him a tank and 2 infantry. And then I got 3 more hits on escort carriers in these other 3 zones. Eggman maximized his protection. Fighters are rolling 6s or less, air to air. So he's trying to knock out as many of my kamikazes as possible. And then the ships, based on the type, destroyers at 2s, cruisers and escort carriers at 3, battleships and fleet carriers at 4 for an AA perspective. So as normal, planes are best weapons against planes, but then you got your big ships to the little ships. So stopping at the end of the air phase, I placed my kamikazes. He placed his fighters and bombers. He does have bombers, and I'll get to that in a second. Then he did the dogfights, which is basically he's rolling 50-50 odds to shoot down as many of my kamikazes as possible. Then his ships fire AA at my kamikazes, and then any survive got to do the attacks. And out of, I think it was 10 kamikaze attacks, rolling at an 8 or less, I only got 3 hits. So I rolled terrible, but out of I think it was 7 fighters, he only got 1 hit, and they were at 50%. So the odds equalized themselves, where we each did poorly in some areas and well in others. And as I said, those are his only casualties. He gets these back. He has an infinite number of transports and landing craft. So really the only casualties now are these infantry and artillery, tank and infantry, and this escort carrier. But damaged escort carriers can't land aircraft, so he's actually going to end up losing 4 more fighters, because they'll have no place to land. His bomber strategy, he could assign bombers and tactical bombers, strategic bombers, to defend the fleet, but they're terrible in air-to-air, so he sent them all He had, I think, 15 rolls, 8 in strategic bombers and 7 in tactical bombers at 4 or less. He needed 6 hits to take this airfield out of action. He got 4. So next turn he'll probably bomb it again and take it out of action. Then he won't have to worry about any more kamikazes from that airfield. So that's where we are. He landed his bombers, and then we stopped for now, because again, these turns are going very slowly because we're just working our way through the rules. But very exciting, exhilarating, thrilling, stressful, fun first turn, doing 30 some kamikaze attacks, and landing the U.S. fleet will be, landing the U.S. Marines will be the next phase that we go to. So we'll pause for now, and then we'll give you an update at the second half of turn 1. Captain G, over and out. Welcome back. This is Captain G. So this is the end of turn 1. Wanted, after the first half on the last video, to finish a complete turn so you could see all the different cycles. Where we left off in the turn sequence was with the U.S. bombers returning. So the next phase was artillery, which includes shore bombardment from battleships. So Eggman, with range and the placement of his ships, he not only took into account his AA defenses and these 4 starting zones when he placed his ships initially, but their range to targets. So in this zone in particular, which is a mountainous zone, he fired, I forget how many shots, but pretty much almost every shot that could hit into this zone from the Task Force 51. And he got 4 hits, but because of the 2 pillboxes, each pillbox can defend 1 infantry paired with 1 artillery. And Japan had, at the time, 4 infantry, 2 artillery. So there were only 2 Japanese infantry outside of the pillbox, if you will, subject to be taken as casualties. So out of the 4 hits, he really only took 2. AA can only be destroyed by air. And again, the other ground units were secure in their fortifications and underground tunnels, etc. All the fighters were gone at that point. So that was a learning point for us, is seeing how important these pillboxes and fortifications are. He got a hit here, and I don't think he fired anything over there. May have gotten a hit there as well. Then the next round was U.S. movement. So that was point 1 that I covered. All of the ships, including transports, have unlimited movement, and they can go into the dark blue seas. So he brought around his transports, landed on this beachhead, and this isn't combat because there are no Japanese ground forces over here. So he had brought a truck, which has higher movement, was able to carry a Marine through these mountains up and secure this open airfield for Japan. And then he started sending a tank this way with the landing craft. So that secured his first airfield without a fight. He also landed a large force here, trying to take out one of the 2 victory cities that he's got to capture, Nago, lightly defended by a handful of militia. And then we spent a lot of time examining this beachfront. So the way we interpret the rules, the beach head, the beach zone, is part of this territory. But because there's no beach on this side, you cannot land troops from this direction. You can only land them here. You're landing in this zone. If it's empty, you just move right in. It's the same zone. It's 1. If it is defended, which this was at the time, then the ground forces that are landing at the beach have to fight their way off the beach. It's an opposed landing. and all of the attackers are -1 to fight their way off the beach. So with that attack, they were able to kill the one militia that was there and secure themselves up. But he had looked at landing here and moving into this mountain territory. The problem we discovered is the different values of these territories. There's a 3 there, for example. There's a 2 here. There's a 1 over here. And then there are territories with no value. It's not always tied to the color, but it's the greens that sometimes have value, sometimes don't. That value represents rough terrain, hilly, mountainous, heavily mountained, if you will. And there's not only a combat modifier, but a movement modifier in the 2s and 3s. So infantry on their own are unable to move into any territory with a 2 or a 3 because of that movement penalty that they would pay. They have to be carried there either by LVTs or by trucks. So once we came to that realization with this beachhead, coming off the transport was one movement. No Marines could on their own hit this space. Now they could be carried by LVTs, but LVTs only have a movement of 2, and they can't be taken into the shallow zone by the transports. They travel on their own. Probably a very convoluted way of explaining it, but basically he couldn't move from the beach, from the sea through the beach into a mountainous territory. He could have landed here, but then he would have been exposing that force to all of the surrounding Japanese artillery, because in this game artillery can attack adjacent territories. So instead, the Marines called an audible, secured these airfields and landed their force here, and then they'll move in at their own pace. So that was something we realized. As we went through that learning process, we also came to realize that the Japanese infantry can't move. This infantry here doesn't have enough movement points to move to these other zones. The only way it could move is it could move out of the mountain into a green territory, something without a movement penalty. So, but you can't move into it. So once you leave that mountain territory, you're not getting back, which meant that these guys, for example, are trapped. There's no green territory for them to move into, which I think reflects their dug-in mentality in the game, and that they weren't, moving all over the place. Combat rules, Japanese forces cannot retreat either, but the U.S. can. So, so then he did all his moves, and the next phase is U.S. combat. So similar to Axis and Allies D-Day, if you will, and some of the 1914 World War I games, you do one round of combat where opposing forces share a land zone. So this force landed, they did one round of combat with the U.S. as the attacker and the Japanese as defender, removed casualties, and that completed the U.S. combat term. After the U.S. combat term, which took us a while after movement, is the Japanese artillery phase. And at the time, this force was here in these mountains, and I saw no reason to keep them there, so I moved them down here to reinforce this area. So now they can shoot into that zone on future turns. So there were no Japanese artillery strikes this round. Then it was Japanese movement, which I just explained, that was the movement. And then Japanese combat. So now again, similar to D-Day, where you have forces, enemy forces, opposing forces sharing land zones, you do one round of combat. This guy was already dead, but in these two zones, now the Japanese were the attackers. The pillboxes do not have any benefit to the Japanese when the Japanese are on offense, and then the defending Marines and U.S. And this is where the retreat rule helps the U.S. If the U.S. wishes, they can retreat at no penalty. The Japanese do have a bonsai attack rule that if they wipe out all the U.S. forces in one of these shared zones, they can move one more zone regardless of movement points in a bonsai attack and do another round of combat there as well. But didn't come into play this game. So just lots of rule nuances that make the game a lot of fun and very interesting. But we're working our way through it because, again, we've never played before. Then after the Japanese combat, U.S. reinforcement phase, and the Japanese reinforcement phase. So basically, the 3 airfields that the U.S. captured, they now get 4 Marine Corps Corsairs on each airfield. It's a one-time bonus you get when you first capture it. And then the Japanese got their Kamikazes back. So casualties, I put, obviously all Kamikazes are a casualty every round, but these are the ones that are not replaced because of the 3 airfields captured. That's 12 Kamikazes the Japanese don't get back. And that's 12 additional fighters now that the U.S. had that they didn't have before. So you can see higher Japanese casualties on the U.S. side, a couple Marines, 1 more infantry to add to what they lost in the Kamikaze with the Bellawood escort carrier. And that ended the phase. The other thing that Egg did is Task Force 58. He moved his fleets around the side of the island. So he's got 1 task force here with battleships and carriers. The battleships he wants for gunfire support, and the carriers he's keeping protected. And then on the other side of the island, he's bringing what's left of his carriers and destroyers, because there's really no purpose to be over here for him at this early in the game. They have unlimited movement now, so he can move around and reinforce these zones. The other thing that we decided on our own, don't know if it's part of the game or not, but looking at the next wave of reinforcements that come in, these are round 1, zone 12, 13, 14, 15. That's what the code system is there. He has more transports and landing craft than troops coming in. So, for example, in this zone, if he's got enough troops to fill only 2 of the transports, we've decided that a Japanese kamikaze doesn't know which one's empty. So in the event that the Japanese make a strike against one of the transports, we'll roll a die to determine whether the one that was damaged, or the one that was hit, rather, was empty or had troops on board. Just adding a layer of randomness. That's not really in the rules, but it just made sense to us. So that's I guess a house rule, if you will, as we're learning the game. And then round 2 is up next. We did not go into round 2 other than the first thing you do at the beginning of each round now is roll initiative. We decided we wanted to know who had initiative. So the US rolled an 11, Japanese rolled a 7, which you subtract 2, so that's really a 5. So the US retains initiative on round 2, which means they get to go first in the steps. If the Japanese had initiative, then some of the order would change, and that the kamikazes would be allowed to have 1 attack per zone before the fighters or the AA rolled. Sort of a free strike, which is nice. So that's where we are at the end of 1 round. It took us a couple days to go through the rules, make sure we had everything, and then 2 days to play this point. But I wanted to get this out. We're learning a lot about the game. If you've played it before, interested in your opinions of it and tips and tricks and finding things like we just did on the movements as we play. And if you haven't, any questions you have, leave them in the comments and we'll try to answer them for you. So far, it's been a lot of fun. Really enjoying it. Like I said, I've been looking forward to this for some time. So with that, I'll put these together and post them. For Eggman, I'm Captain G. Over and out.